Hi, and welcome to DevCar TV's guide on the normal and heroic versions of the Xavius encounter in the Emerald Dream Raid live on patch 7.0.3. The Xavius encounter has 3 phases initiated whenever Xavius falls beneath 65% health and then 30% health respectively. Each phase has a different set of mechanics. Xavius has an energy bar that when it reaches 100, he will summon adds. Some of these adds are high priority burst targets, particularly during phase 1 and 2. He won't spawn them often, and players will spend most of their time DPSing Xavius. When the encounter begins, all players will gain an extra resource bar that tracks your corruption. Corruption is gained from several of Xavius' abilities, and at certain points, players will begin to hallucinate, causing new mechanics that only they can see or be affected by. It is important to avoid gaining corruption at too fast a rate, as these additional mechanics deal heavy damage on top of the already difficult fight. At 33 corruption, players see Dread Abominations appear in the shadows at the edges of the encounter area. The Dread Abominations will cast crushing shadows about every 10 seconds. This creates a large pink circle where the abomination will smash its limb into the ground. Players at the center of the circle will take extremely high damage. The damage is reduced the farther away you are from the center. The range is massive, so you cannot fully outrange the ability. Run as far away from the center of the AoE as is possible. At 66 corruption or higher, players will be affected by Unfathomable Reality. Smaller pink swirls respawn in random locations around the encounter area every few seconds. After 3 seconds, a pillar of nightmare flames will erupt from the targeted locations. This deals moderate damage to players within 6 yards of the eruption. Players struck by this damage will also gain 5 corruption. If an Unfathomable Reality zone spawns near you, move away. When a player reaches 100 corruption, they will gain the Descent into Madness buff. For 20 seconds, the player's damage and healing is increased by 150%. When this buff wears off, the player gains Madness and becomes Mind Control. The Mind Control player transforms into a creature of madness and will attack the players with Smash. The Mind Control player's health is increased by 150%, and creatures of madness are immune to all CCs except stuns. A player who transforms into a creature of madness must be killed, taking valuable DPS and resources away from managing Xavius and his mechanics, as well as increasing the likelihood that other players will become mind controlled. On normal difficulty, a player's corruption slowly decays. On heroic, it will not, so be careful. Some sources of corruption are unavoidable, but most can be avoided if the raid executes the strategy properly. Most players should be able to avoid becoming mind controlled. It is likely that some players will reach 100 corruption before the final phase of the fight, which is a race against time burn phase. Those players should take advantage of the 20-second Descent into Madness buff and focus DPS on Xavius to attempt to kill him before transforming. The second important mechanic is the Dream Simulacrum. The Dream of Ysera appears when Xavius reaches 95% health and again when he reaches 60%. This is right at the start of phase 1 and again at the start of phase 2. Phase 3 has no dream. Half of the raid enters the dream each time, so every player will see the dream mechanic. Ysera will take an even split of roles, so there are always tanks and healers in the dream. The players taken for the first dream are chosen at random. The raid cannot influence what players are selected. While in the dream, players' bodies are unconscious, but the players may still interact in the encounter as a dream simulacrum version of themselves. Taking damage and corruption gained while the player is in the dream is erased when the player's dream ends. Additionally, any cooldowns used during the dream are restored when the player awakens. Healers should note that any mana they spend during the dream is refunded when they awaken. The dream will last for 3 minutes or until the player takes fatal damage or the player reaches 100 corruption and will become mind controlled. In the later case, the player will benefit fully from the 20-second corruption Descent into Madness buff. Dream players should assist the raid by performing tasks or soaking mechanics that cause corruption gain. Dreaming tanks should taunt the corruption horror or taunt Xavius during nightmare infusion. Dreaming healers should be primarily dispellers or tank debuffs. Dreaming players should intercept lurking terrors, soak corruption meteors, and absorb tainted discharge pools. The goal within the dream is to protect the raid as much as possible from corruption gains as to prolong your stay in the dream so that you will reach 100 corruption and gain the Descent into Madness throughput buff. When players enter the dream, and again when they emerge from the dream, they are set to 0 corruption. For those players who entered the dream in the second phase, any corruption they gained during phase 1 is also removed. This makes it okay to spread some corruption during phase 1 to the non-dreaming players. For example, if your raid has 3 healers, and only one is chosen by Ysera to enter the phase 1 dream, the non-dreaming healers can help dispel tanks, since they will lose their corruption gains when they enter the Phase 2 Dream. It is still ideal to minimize corruption gains so that the raid is not overwhelmed with the crushing shadows or unfathomable reality mechanics. Players who were not dreaming during Phase 2 must be careful with their corruption gain, as it will not be cleared again during the encounter. Now for a rundown of each phase. During Phase 1, Xavius was summoning Lurking Terror and Corruption Horror adds and threatened the raid with Nightmare Blades. The adds are the most important part of this phase, as they cause players to reach high corruption values. When Xavius reaches 100 energy, he will summon one of the two types of adds, either Lurking Terrors or Corruption Horror. Xavius gains 5 energy per second and therefore summons adds every 20 seconds. Usually Xavius summons a Lurking Terror who will appear under a random player with a Lurking Eruption. However, 1 minute into the fight, and again at 2 minutes 20 seconds, Xavius will instead cast Manifest Corruption. These are the third and 7th times that Xavius reaches 100 energy. Manifest Corruption deals heavy raid-wide damage and creates a Corruption Horror. Lurking Eruption spawns a Lurking Terror, which will cast Tormenting Fixation on its target. It appears suddenly under a random player and deals moderate damage. Lurking Eruption prefers ranged players and will not target players in the dream. It causes splash damage to all players within 6 yards, so the raid should be spread out. Their Lurking Terror spawns instantly, but is inactive for approximately 4 seconds before casting Tormenting Fixation. Tormenting Fixation causes the Lurking Terror to endlessly pursue its target whenever the Lurking Terror intercepts any player. It will cast Tormenting Infection on that player and then despawn. Tormenting Infection deals heavy damage and grants the player 15 corruption. The player targeted with Tormenting Fixation should kite the Lurking Terror away from other players. A player in the dream should then intercept the Lurking Terror and soak the Tormenting Infection damage and corruption gain. The player targeted by the Lurking Eruption should move away from their location as soon as it spawns, so the whole raid can easily see where the Lurking Terror will be kited. It may be beneficial to mark a location to kite the terror towards, so that players in the dream will be able to quickly position themselves to interrupt Tormenting Infection. On occasions where Xavius casts Manifest Corruption, instead of summoning a Lurking Terror, a Corruption Horror will spawn. The Corruption Horror is a priority target that must be tanked and killed quickly. Every 20 seconds, the Horror will cast Corrupting Nova. Damaging all players in the raid and giving them 5 corruption. Every 12 seconds, the Corruption Horror casts Tormenting Swipe at its target. Tormenting Swipe does heavy damage to all players in front of the Horror and gives those players 10 corruption. The Dreaming Tank should taunt the Corruption Horror when it spawns and bring it near the boss for cleave damage. Face the Corruption Horror away from the raid. All DPS should swap to the Corruption Horror immediately and burn it down quickly to limit Corrupting Nova casts. During the Corruption Horrors, spawn at 1 minute and 2 minutes and 20 seconds into the fight and save short-term DPS throughput cooldowns to help kill these adds quickly. Healers should use cooldowns to recover from the Manifest Corruption damage, particularly Dreaming healers whose cooldowns will be fresh when they exit the dream anyway. In addition to these adds, Xavius will attack the raid with Nightmare Blades. Nightmare Blades cut a cord across the encounter area, passing through both targets. Every 15 seconds, Xavius chooses 2 targets. Tanks are ineligible targets, otherwise any player could be chosen, including players already in the dream. The targets gain the Nightmare Blades debuff and are marked with a red arrow. After 4 seconds, a wall of blades will spawn and it traverses a straight line through the 2 targets. Any player struck by these will take heavy damage and be knocked back. Nightmare Blades is extremely dangerous, especially while the Corruption Horror is active. The targeted players must move out of the raid to avoid striking other players with the Nightmare Blades wall. Run out to the side of the boss so that melee DPS targets can take a sharp path. Particularly avoid striking the tanks with the Nightmare Blades. Consider dropping a world marker to designate which side of the room players with Nightmare Blades should run to, since the room itself is featureless. Finally, during Phase 1, Xavius attacks the tank with Darkening Soul, a stacking debuff that deals heavy periodic damage. Darkening Soul is applied to the current tank approximately every 8 to 10 seconds. The dot damage is heavy, and tanks will have to swap fairly frequently to avoid taking fatal damage or running healers out of mana. The Darkening Soul debuff has no duration and can only be removed by dispels. When Darkening Soul is dispelled, it deals heavy damage, darkening discharge damage to all players within 25 yards of the dispelled tank. In addition, the dispelling healer takes darkening damage and gains 25 corruption. Tanks must run away from the raid before healers can dispel Darkening Soul. Run to the opposite side of the room from the Nightmare Blade's target. Most group tank swaps at 3 to 4 stacks, which is approximately every 30 seconds. Use heavier cooldowns at the higher stacks of Darkening Soul. Try to have a cooldown of some sort active when dispelled, as Darken Discharge is extremely heavy damage. If you are tooth tanking, the tank who is not in the dream will be taking Xavius for a long period of time while the dream tank handles the corruption bar. The non-dreaming tank should save their heaviest cooldowns and activate mitigation abilities for this time. If you are 3 tanking, then 2 tanks can continue to swap as normally scheduled for Darkening Soul while the dream tank handles the corruption bar. Dreaming healers should be in charge of dispelling the Darkening Soul debuff from tanks. Each healer can only dispel 4 times before their dream will end due to reaching 100 corruption. If more than one healer is in the dream, be sure to cycle dispelling duties so both healers stay in the dream for a longer period of time. If only one healer is in the dream, non-dreaming healers can occasionally help dispel, since when they get to phase 2, their corruption will be cleared. Phase 1 lasts until Xavius' health reaches 65%. Avoid pushing Xavius to phase 2 with the corruption horror still alive. Now for phase 2. During phase 2, Xavius will summon inconceivable horror ads and threaten the raid with Corruption Meteor and Bonds of Terror. Each time Xavius reaches 100 energy, he will cast Call of Nightmares, summoning a set of inconceivable horrors. Xavius will reach 100 energy every 40 seconds. The number of inconceivable horrors he will spawn depends upon the raid size. The inconceivable horrors spawn at the edge of the encounter area and walk slowly towards Xavius. When an inconceivable horror gets close to Xavius, it will begin to channel Dark Ruination. Dark Ruination empowers Xavius to emanate waves of damage once every second. Dark Ruination damage is moderate, and players also gain 1 corruption per tick. Xavius will do this for each inconceivable horror that reaches him. This has the potential to deal fatal damage or overload the raid's corruption bars if too many ads reach Xavius. The raid should kill inconceivable horrors quickly, and use slows, stuns, CC abilities to keep them away from Xavius. Melee DPS and non-tanking tanks should attack the nearest horrors, while ranged DPS should attack the horrors further from the boss. When an inconceivable horror dies, it dissolves into a Tainted Discharge pool. After 15 seconds, Tainted Discharge pools will spawn a new inconceivable horror ad. Players can prevent this by standing in Tainted Discharge pools and absorbing them. Doing this causes moderate shadow damage each second and also grants 4 corruption. Only Dream players should soak up the Tainted Discharge pools. It is important to prevent inconceivable horrors from respawning, so that the raid can focus DPS on Xavius. Tanks can drag Xavius away from approaching inconceivable horrors if necessary. Approximately every 30 seconds, Xavius will target a player with Corruption Meteor. Tanks cannot be targeted by this, but all other players are valid targets. The targeted player is marked with a black arrow and draws a red circle to depict the radius of the Corruption Meteor attack. After 5 seconds, a Corruption Meteor will strike the targeted player, dealing extremely heavy damage and generating 40 corruption. This damage and corruption is split evenly between all players inside the Corruption Meteor's area of effect. Players in the dream should help split the Corruption Meteor damage, while players who were not in the dream should avoid it. Mark a location for the Corruption Meteor target to run to. Players in the dream should be near this location so that they do not have to move much to help soak. Players who were not in the dream should stay away. Healers should use cooldowns to recover from the Corruption Meteor damage when necessary. Every 15 seconds, Xavius will choose 2 targets for Bonds of Terror, linking them together. Tanks cannot be targeted by this, but all other players are valid targets. Each targeted player takes light to moderate periodic damage. Bonds of Terror is removed when the 2 marked players come within 3 yards of each other. Linked players should run together, but since this mechanic does not give corruption, it does not take high priority over the other mechanics. In Phase 2, Xavius attacks the tanks with Blackening Soul, a stacking debuff that deals heavy periodic damage. Blackening Soul is applied to the current tank approximately every 8 to 10 seconds. The dot damage is heavy and tanks will have to swap fairly frequently to avoid taking fatal damage or running healers out of mana. The Blackening Soul debuff has no duration and can only be removed by dispels. When the Blackening Soul is dispelled, the tank gains Blackened, taking 150% increased physical damage for 30 seconds. In addition, the Dispelling Healer takes Blackened tainting damage and gains 25 Corruption. Due to the 30-second Blackened debuff, tanks should swap every 3 to 4 stacks. The periodic damage is very high at these stack levels, so be sure to use stronger cooldowns or activate mitigation to survive. Like with the Darkening Soul debuff, Dreaming Healers should be in charge of dispelling the Blackening Soul debuff from tanks. Each healer can only dispel 4 times before their dream will end due to reaching 100 Corruption. If more than one healer is in the dream, be sure to cycle between dispelling duties so both healers stay in the dream for a longer period of time. Additionally, Xavius will buff himself with Nightmare Infusion, causing his melee attacks to also grant his target 5 Corruption. Xavius gains this buff once a minute and it lasts for 10 seconds. The Dreaming Tank should taunt Xavius during this time to safely eat the Corruption gain. Depending on the timing, the Nightmare Infusion tank will gain 1 to 2 stacks of Blackening Soul. Tanks should plan around this when scheduling their tank swaps so that Dream Tank stacks do not get too high. Phase 2 lasts until Xavius reaches 30% health. Make sure not to push Xavius to Phase 3 until all Tainted Discharge pulls have been absorbed. Dark Ruination during Phase 3 will surely cause wipes. Finally, we've made it to the end of the road. Phase 3. The final phase of the encounter is the Hectic Burn phase. The raid must defeat Xavius before the inevitable Corruption gains the lead to too many players, transforming them into creatures of madness and causing wipes. Use Bloodlust or Heroism during this phase. Use strong cooldowns at the start of the phase, and that'll help remove a strong chunk of his health. In my group, we found it beneficial to ignore all mechanics of Phase 3 and to purely burn down Xavius before we all became corrupted. For the sake of making this guide, I'll review them. When Xavius reaches 100 energy during this phase, he will cast Riding Deep. Xavius gains 5 energy per second, so this occurs every 20 seconds. Riding Deep summons several Nightmare Tentacle acts. The number summoned depends upon the number of players in the raid. Nightmare Tentacles cast Nightmare Bolt at a random non-tank target every 3 seconds. Nightmare Bolt does moderate damage but increases the target's corruption by 3. Nightmare Bolt cannot be interrupted and the Nightmare Tentacles are immune to CC effects. Nightmare Tentacles are immobile and do not need to be tanked as they have no melee attack. They are a constant source of unavoidable corruption gains, but the raid must balance killing the tentacles with killing Xavius. Tanks should drag Xavius to nearby Nightmare Tentacles so that efficient cleave abilities can kill them. Multi-dotting Nightmare Tentacles is beneficial, especially if this increases your single target damage via procs or resources. It is not important to kill every Nightmare Tentacle. The goal is to reduce raid damage and corruption gain, just enough to avoid premature deaths or mind-controlled players. Xavius will continue to use abilities from both Phase 1 and Phase 2 throughout this phase. Nightmare Blades will occur every 33 seconds, Corruption Meteor will occur every 45 seconds. Tanks are afflicted with Blackening Soul, which still affects healers with Blackened Tainting when dispelled, and still debuffs the tanks when Blackened Taint. Xavius buffs himself with Nightmare Infusion every minute. Because this phase is a race against the corruption bar, the raid must do its best to spread out these corruption gains. There will be no more dream mechanic to help manage corruption. The raid should stack up so that the Corruption Meteor is easy to heal through and spares its corruption over the largest number of targets possible. Players targeted by the Nightmare Blades must run out to the side to avoid hitting the rest of the raid. The lowest corruption healer should dispel Blackening Soul on each tank swap. The lowest corruption tank should taunt Xavius for each Nightmare Infusion buff. It is very likely that at least some players will reach 100 corruption during this phase. Ideally, these players can use the corruption Descent into Madness buff to do extremely high damage to Xavius and end the encounter before the buff expires. If any players become mind controlled, the raid will have to decide whether they can ignore, stun, or keep attacking Xavius, or if they need to quickly kill off the player and perhaps use a Battle Resurrection. There are no listed mechanical differences on heroic difficulty, although several abilities cause more corruption than on normal. Thank you so much for watching this in-depth guide on the Xavius encounter, and please, if you enjoyed, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe. Content comes daily and it's much appreciated. Thank you for watching this video. You guys have a good one and good luck in your encounters.